A girl named Grace lived in a quaint suburban neighborhood among whispering pine trees and moonlit streets. She was a curious child with big eyes and an imagination that danced on the edge of reality. But deep within Grace's innocence lay a fear that gripped her every night as she lay in bed and stared wide-eyed into the darkness. It all started with a simple whisper, a faint rustling under her bed, like autumn leaves fluttering. At first, Grace treated it like the wind playing with her ears. But as the nights passed, the whispers grew louder, accompanied by strange moans and ominous mutterings that sent shivers down her spine. Grace jumped out of bed in fear, letting out a low scream. "Grace, are you okay?" Her mother called from the hallway with concern in her voice. Just a bad dream, Mom," Grace replied, tucking herself tighter into the blanket, her heart pounding in her chest. But it wasn't just a bad dream. Lurking in the shadows beneath her bed was something far more sinister, a being of darkness born from the depths of nightmares. When the moon cast its silvery light through the window, Grace lay awake every night, carefully listening to rustles and sounds. She clutched the blanket tightly in fear. Suddenly, she heard the sound of claws scratching the wooden floor, moving closer and closer to her bed. Her heart raced as she dared to look over the edge, only to be met by a pair of glowing, evil eyes staring at her from the darkness below. "Grace," hissed a voice that seemed to pierce the very fabric of her being. "I know you're here, Grace." Grace's breath caught in her throat, her whole body shaking with fear. "Who are you?" she stuttered, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "I am the darkness that lurks in your dreams," answered the voice, dripping with anger. "I am the nightmare that haunts your every thought. And now, Grace, I have come for you." Grace's thoughts raced as she tried to comprehend the horror unfolding before her. "What do you want?" Her voice trembled with fear. "I want to absorb your fear," the creature whispered, its voice slithering like a snake in the darkness. "I want to feed on your terror until there is nothing left but emptiness." "Mom, I'm scared! Save me from the monster!" Grace shouted sharply in a trembling voice. Her mother entered the room with a tired smile and knelt next to the bed. "There's nothing to be afraid of, darling," she reassured her, wrapping Grace tightly in the blankets. "Monsters are not real, they're just made up." But no matter how hard she tried, Grace couldn't get rid of the feeling of fear that tormented her all night. She lay awake for hours, straining her ears for the slightest sound, convinced the monster under the bed was waiting for the perfect moment to attack. She again heard faint scratching coming from under the bed. Her heart skipped a beat, and she held her breath, her eyes darting around the room in horror. "Mom!" Grace stammered, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "The monster is here! I'm terrified! Please help me!" Her mother sighed softly, her patience worn thin after countless attempts to console her daughter. "Grace, there are no monsters," she said firmly. "It's just your imagination playing tricks on you. Now I need to sleep." But Grace couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that settled in her stomach. She closed her eyes tightly, praying that the scratching would stop. But the sound grew louder and more insistent, until Grace felt like her heart was about to jump out of her chest. Suddenly, with a low guttural growl, the monster crawled out from under the bed. Grace's eyes widened in horror as she looked into his glowing red eyes, his sharp teeth glinting in the moonlight. "Mom!" Grace screamed, tears streaming down her cheeks as she reached for her mother's comforting embrace. But her mother was nowhere to be found. The monster rushed forward, extending its sharp claws and grabbing Grace's trembling figure. With a roar, he dragged her under the bed into the darkness below. The next day, Grace's parents found her room empty, her bed in disarray, and the window open. They frantically searched the house, shouting her name in desperation. But their beloved daughter was nowhere to be seen. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the memories of little Grace faded into obscurity. Her parents were inconsolable. Their grief was felt in every corner of the house. They tirelessly searched for the traces of their daughter, but all their efforts were unsuccessful. They were forced to mourn the loss of their precious child, haunted by the knowledge that they had failed to protect her from what they considered a fantasy. Meanwhile, beneath the creaking floorboards of Grace's room, a monster lurked in the shadows, unseen by the adults. Its presence reminiscent of an ominous ghost, haunting the once cheerful home. It was a nightmarish creature, with sinewy limbs and jagged claws, that clawed at the wooden beams, leaving a trail of terror in its wake. But Grace was not the first child to fall victim to the monster's insatiable hunger. This creature lays claim to its prey under the beds of countless homes, in towns and villages everywhere, leaving behind only whispers of fear and despair. One moonlit night, when the world was fast asleep, a boy named Oliver found himself face to face with the same thing that had consumed the nightmarish Grace. Like her, he lay awake in bed, his heart pounding at the sound of scratching beneath him. "Mom, where are you?" Oliver whispered into the darkness, his voice trembling with fear. But unlike Grace's, Oliver's mother wasn't there to comfort him. With a shaking hand, Oliver reached for the flashlight on the bedside table, his fingers fumbling nervously as he turned it on. A beam of light pierced the darkness, illuminating the space under his bed with an eerie glow. And there, lurking in the shadows, was the monster. His eyes glowed with an evil light as he snarled at Oliver, his razor-sharp teeth glinting in the dim light. But instead of cowering in terror, Oliver's fear turned to anger, his heart burning with a fierce determination to confront this creature. Gathering his courage, Oliver jumped out of bed, waving his flashlight like a weapon, facing the monster. Determined, he made it clear that he was not afraid of anything. With a defiant cry, he drove the creature back, forcing it to retreat into the darkness from where it had appeared. "I'm not afraid of you! I am not afraid of you!" the boy shouted confidently. The monster did not expect such a reaction. Due to the boy's lack of fear, he disappeared into the lantern's light without leaving a trace behind him. Oliver sighed with incredible relief. He found it hard to believe that he had overcome his fear. He became a symbol of courage and bravery, showing by his example that one can and should fight one's fears. One cannot give up, never.